Today's Religion Media Centre briefing is on the United Methodist Church's General Conference decision to overturn its rules on same-sex relationships. It's overturned the ban on self-avowed homosexuals to be ministers and the ruling that the practice of homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching. And it has declared support for same-sex marriage, saying all marriage is sacred, lifelong covenant that brings two people of faith together. The decisions were passed with massive majorities, and they follow years of rancorous debate during which a quarter of the churches have left in protest. So to discuss the momentous events of the conference, we're joined by a panel of speakers, and they are Heather Hahn from United Methodist News, the assistant news editor, Stephen Adair, the director of local church services for United Methodist Communications, the Reverend Jennifer Smith, the Superintendent Minister of Wesley's Chapel in London, and the Reverend Lindsay Bainham Freeman from Virginia, Bishop Monday Muobo from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Doctors Joseph Roso and David Eagle from Duke University. So there's a lot of you there. And what we're going to do is say thank you very much for joining, first of all. And I'll ask questions of each of you individually, and then please ask questions of each other afterwards and pick up points that are raised. And we're hoping for a fruitful discussion today. So I'm going to start with you, Heather, if I may. Heather, we were following your reports and your team's reports during the conference, and several of us were tuning in live as well as the debates continued. And it was a 10-day conference, so I guess that you're all recovering from it now. One of your colleagues said that this was the most consequential general conference since the 1968 assembly that created the United Methodist Church. And I wonder if that's how it felt to you.
Full disclosure, I was not alive in 1968. So I can't really compare. But I would say, yes, it feels like a rebirth. And so just a little history, so folks who might not know will know. So we were the Uniting Conference that you mentioned in 1968 took place, and that's what formed the United Methodist Church. We were a merger of the Methodist Church and the Evangelical United Brethren. And so United came from that name, United Brethren, and then from the Methodist Church, the United Methodist Church. And then 1972, we had a whole new slate of social principles to look at, just like we did this time. And they added the language for the first time, the first mention of homosexuality ever in our book of discipline for either branch was to say that the practice of homosexuality, ... there were a few words in between, is incompatible with Christian teaching. And that has been a source of tension ever since. And it all culminated in 2019. Now, this had come after years of defiance from some groups in the church, who were not going with this. We already had, in 2019, had an openly gay and married bishop, Bishop Karen Oliveto. But then in 2019, by a relatively narrow vote of 438 to 384, they adopted the traditional plan, which added more sort of enforcement mechanisms for restrictions. The thing is, it didn't really take. And over the last 5 years, we've seen churches disaffiliate because they didn't want to be. They could kind of see where the church was going, it seemed, and it did not. It was one of those weird things where the folks who had sort of been these advocacy groups for strengthening restrictions absolutely prevailed, had their legislative goals prevail at the 2019 Special General Conference. But when it came to, particularly in the U.S., where it came from, it didn't really stick. And so we ended up with a whole bunch of different delegates.
The actual voting at the conference was quite confusing because there were various motions bundled up. But the voting was overwhelmingly in favour of removing all this legislation. So I've got one figure here, 692 to 51, and the others were comparable, that kind of size of a majority. Where did this opposition come from, the smaller number? Are there traditionalists still left within the United Methodist Church who were rallying against it despite their small number in the group?
Absolutely. And again, I really got to be careful here that, we are an international church. And so perspectives of the Americans are not necessarily, so we had a fairly moderate to progressive. And if you look at American public opinion on same-sex marriage, we're now at a supermajority in this country in support of it in the US. But we still have people from a variety of countries and with very different perspectives and very different legal contexts. We still have some absolutely American traditionalists, and they were there. But I got to be careful here. The 692 to 51 vote you're talking about, that was on a consent calendar that included other kinds of legislation. It wasn't just this. It was a whole bunch of different legislation. But the fact that the consent calendar passed so overwhelmingly is pretty typical for any general conference. It's just that you normally don't have anything this groundbreaking on it. And that's amazing. And even the stuff that passed with, that was debated on the floor did pass with sizable majorities, which was pretty amazing. Again, we weren't seeing the relatively narrow things we saw in 2019.
Could I turn to Stephen Adair? Stephen, you live tweeted the entire conference, I think, on your own, which was an incredible feat. And several of us were following you over here. You're the Director of Local Church Services, United Methodist Communications, but you were telling me that you're also part of the LGBTQ plus community and have been a member of the United Methodist Church for 36 years. So what was the reaction? What was your reaction? You were tweeting away when the votes went through by such large majorities.
It's funny. I've talked to people about it, and sometimes I had to ask questions about what happened, even though I was really deep into it, minute by minute, because I didn't have a lot of time to process before we moved on to the next thing. It was fast. I'll just say that, but it was great, and
fast, yeah.
Even from the press room, it was such, you could just feel a different spirit in the air.
There also a moment of jubilation, a kind of pop-up moment of jubilation where people got around and sang choruses and prayed with one another. What happened then?
I was taking screenshot videos. I was learning as I was going on this one. But I was taking screenshot videos of also just telling the story. That's what people wanted to see online. Not only the vote totals on all the different types of legislation, not just the hot topic issues that were being reported by the media, but to really tell a full story of everything that we were accomplishing together. But it was great to not only experience that really close to the floor, but also, to be able to share that story online. So everybody at home.
Thank you. Moving on to the Reverend Lindsay Bainham Freeman. And we've heard already, Lindsay, that you were not only in one of the delegations, you were chair of one of the legislative committees as well. And without getting into the nitty-gritty of how the whole process works over there, what was the reaction amongst the clergy that you knew in the conference hall when the votes came through with such large majorities?
A bit of shock, I would say. Heather has already mentioned that the first vote was on a consent calendar. And I think it took a lot of us a moment to realize that it was on the consent calendar. And so then you talk about that outbreak of singing hymns and songs and testimonies from clergy and laity alike that just kind of organically happened. And in that space, the delegates sat on one side and then there was a wall for the observers, and we kind of met at the wall to sing and rejoice together. And so I think for some clergy that I have relationship with in that room, there is a sigh of relief as well, that we can continue forward in a way that sees all people while holding on to the intricacies and complexities of being a worldwide church.
There was a report that the Religion News Service ran that said that was a minister who's age 40 and has lifelong been in a same-sex marriage, and for the first time came out in front of his congregation last Sunday. Have you heard of other stories like that? Is that what's happening at the moment?
I think so. I will say in that space, we were asked for the monitors to name our age, our demographic, our pronouns, our gender, things like that. And after that kind of monumental vote, people started identifying as queer or lesbian, or right. And so I felt that they sensed a safe place in our holy conferencing to do that. In our own conference, we had a young man come out to our delegation and to his community that he serves as well in the past week. And so I just rejoice for folks who can live fully into their calling and who they are.
It's only a matter of days since the decisions were taken, so this is probably an unfair question, but how has it gone down amongst the ordinary Methodist in the pew?
Yeah, so I guess I have a biased perspective. The church that I serve has already had a lot of these difficult conversations, and we are an inclusive church, welcoming of all, not a reconciling congregation, which is a process that churches go through, but we're pretty close. And so folks who are not in line with the changes made in the last 2 weeks have already gone on to be a part of other worshiping communities. And so when I stood up to preach on Sunday and put on my rainbow stole at communion, there was tears and smiles and joy of the work that our denomination did.
Thank you. I want to move on now to Dr. Joseph Roso and Dr. David Eagle, joining us together from Duke University, because you've written a report on what happened with disaffiliation of churches in North Carolina as the churches left. And the picture that you paint of the church is not that one group of traditionalists left, leaving progressives behind. The picture you paint is of a very mixed view, both amongst the clergy and the congregation. Can you give us some of the stats, the evidence that you found?
A lot of the major national news media painted the decisions that happened at GC 2024 as a strong progressive swing in the United Methodist Church. I don't think that's quite the right way to characterize it. In our own research, which took place among United Methodists in North Carolina, we've been surveying them for over 15 years, so we have a pretty good understanding of this population. I'll also say that North Carolina, in many ways, is a state that represents the U.S. Fairly well overall. Things that happen in North Carolina often reflect broader national trends. Of course, there's lots of regional variation. What we found in North Carolina was that among the clergy who have remained in the denomination post 2024, about 27% of clergy either slightly or somewhat disagree with the statement that same-sex couples or same-sex clergy should be ordained, or LGBTQ plus clergy should be ordained, and about 51% are strongly in favor of the ordination of LGBTQ plus clergy. And so that's on the clergy side. It's a little more difficult on the congregant side, but we've had pastors try to estimate the sort of the dominant position in their congregations. And there we found that, about 40% of churches in the United Methodist Church would be largely opposed to the ordination of same-sex clergy. 40% would be somewhere in the middle, where people maybe hold relatively diverse views on that topic. And about 20% of congregations in the state would be what I would call progressive and pretty much almost.
What does that tell you about the makeup of the conference then, with overwhelming majorities there and this very split, almost 50-50 split that you found in North Carolina?
This mirrors broader trends in American religion amongst American Protestants generally. People who go to church and are affiliated with churches in the United States tend to be more conservative than people who don't. And so that's reflected in pews. The United Methodist Church, especially in North Carolina and other parts across the southeastern jurisdiction, has a lot of presence in rural communities and rural areas. So that's a big constituency of the church. And there again, in rural America, views differ. So churches are decidedly purple entities. Clergy definitely are more progressive. And it's really, if you look at the sort of makeup of the folks who have left, I like to say, to use a sort of American political analogy, we've lost kind of the freedom caucus of the United Methodist Church. The people who are on the right side or the right wing theologically and politically, and we're really into obstructionism, into really trying to fight to get their position to be the position of the whole denomination. Those folks have left, and what you have left behind, I think, is a group of people who do want to stay together. They want to work together, even though they recognize that there is division.
Another thing that you found in the report was that those clergy that remained were dealing with very high levels of stress because they were in the position of keeping the different factions, if you like, within the congregation together. Tell us a bit more of what you found and what you predict the future might be now for the church moving forward.
Certainly. So I think it's important to keep in mind that the congregations that were leaving the denomination were pretty uniform in their position on same-sex marriage and their general theology. So while congregations that were staying were divided in many ways, were purple, like David said, though the congregations, the pastors who left were very uniform. And so what we found is that the congregations who left were largely on the same page about things. They reported, clergy of those congregations reported that there were relatively low levels of conflict in those congregations. And another work, David and a colleague have found in initial work that kind of conflict, that kind of mismatch can result in higher levels of stress, depression, burnout among clergy. And so we kind of picked up on that in the report. We found that clergy who are pastoring congregations who left, or clergy who stayed, were about twice as likely to report symptoms of clinically significant depression. They were about 50% more likely to report symptoms of generalized anxiety disorder. And they were more likely to report burnout and feeling like maybe they don't want to continue in the clergy occupation. That was in 2021. Is where most of our data come from in the report we wrote. And so that was in the midst of it. This was in like the storm. Nobody knows what's happening. It is a very complicated, challenging time. But we have noticed in our most recent wave of data collection, 2023, and I don't want to make too many strong statements about this so far because we haven't really dug into the data quite yet, but we're seeing what appears to be a little bit of a reversion back to baseline. That it seems like the storm has passed and clergy are learning and are finding ways to continue their ministry. There may have been clergy who left because of the, stress, because of the really difficult time. But we're seeing, I think, some healing that's happening. It's going to be they're going to be deep wounds. There's a lot of church hurt going around, and I like to say church hurt hurts different because it's such an important thing to so many people. And so there's going to need to continue to be a lot of resources and effort dedicated towards healing and towards managing differences within congregations. But among the clergy, it seems like while it was very challenging and while divisions they had to manage were very stressful, that I think going forward, they're going to start healing and moving back to sort of a more baseline normal level of mental health.
Thank you. We are going to go on to regionalization now, which was another set of votes taken at the conference. And I wonder, Lindsay, if I could ask you very briefly to explain what happened. Regionalization is the term we have for it, that there were 4 regions: Africa, Europe, the Philippines, and the United States, of the United Methodist Church. What changes were made at the conference to that organization?
Sure. So the legislation is proposing 8 regions, and historically, the language of central conferences has been tied to racism in the United Methodist Church and in the U.S. And so this legislation would take away the language of central conferences, make the U.S. a region, and then other areas such as Central and Southern Europe, the Congo, Germany, Northern Europe, the Philippines, West Africa, and Africa would be regions. And so what would happen if, as the jurisdictions fall away in the U.S., there would be a gathering of these regions that can adapt parts of Section 6 of the discipline. This legislation would not allow adaptations for our Constitution, our theological task, our doctrine, things like that. But our central conferences now have the ability to adapt portions of the discipline, and this would bring the U.S. in alignment with that as well.
So that would mean that countries where homosexuality is punishable by death or banned could decide that they had a different take on homosexuality within, or LGBTQ plus issues within the church than the US.
Yes, absolutely. And I think the interesting and, again, the complexity, as Stephen has said, is that this conference was working on the removal of restrictive and harmful language and worldwide regionalization. And regionalization allows us to remain a connectional church while having removed harmful language. And so we're trying to sort through both of those actions together, knowing full well that some countries it is punishable by law. So.
Thank you. So moving to Bishop Monday Miobo from the North Katanga Conference in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Thank you very much for joining us. I think you're still in the States, aren't you, after your attendance at the conference? Just asking you first about regionalization. Do you welcome that? What difference will it make to your church?
Well, let me paraphrase Lindsay and say that this is something that has been in progress, because if you read our book of discipline, I think paragraph 2201, that creates the Standing Committee on Central Conference Matters, then General Conference recognized the complexity as the church was moving to new places, to new countries, to new cultures. And that, of course, became an opportunity, but also a challenge, because you then have a mosaic of cultures trying to come together, in matters of faith, which is normal, but then when it comes in matters of societal issues, it became a little bit complex. So the Standing Committee was created in order to help adapt certain part of the Book of Discipline, as Lindsay indicated. Whenever General Conference will enact something will be in conflict with the ethos of Central Conferences, then through paragraph 101, they had a chance to adapt.
For you personally, can you just explain to us the desire of you, your colleagues, others within your own region to stay within the United Methodist Church, whatever may be happening from the conference in the United States?
Yeah, going back to your previous question first, I will say that we are excited about regionalization because it allows us to live fully in our context while remaining connected. And I will tell you why. The United Methodist Church has done and continues to do tremendous work in terms of education, health, agriculture, climate change, from a missional perspective. So we would like to remain connected because we value our diversity. We value the mission work that is being done, very transformative. Even our own persona, we are the product of the mission of the United Methodist Church. So that's why we believe that marriage, in as much as we have differences in terms of how we understand marriage, that is cultural. I mean, every culture, in my culture, marriage is defined not by the Bible, but by my own tribal cultural values. So there are a lot of things that put us together, and one of them is mission.
How come that the Methodists have reached this amicable solution and a compromise where the Anglicans, who we report on a lot from our base in London, have found this so hard that this is a first order issue which is splitting the Anglican communion, but the Methodists have found a way of getting along with one another? Why is that?
Let me say that, we always talk about the Bible, but I think to do good theology, you need to add a dimension of experience, of culture, tradition, revelation, and so forth. For so long, as Africans, we have been caught between what I can call Antioch and Jerusalem. Folks in the US tended to use us as proxies, but we took the time to learn, to build relationships, and understand ourselves what was at stake. I think for us, that was a liberating moment to be able to say, we should allow the US to be a region and do its adaptive work, because we can only stop at mission, but also have to go towards ministries. There are areas where people felt they needed to minister to people who had different understanding of marriage. Not only marriage, but so many other things. And we only focus on marriage. I think there are other issues that are truly contextual. I think the fact that central conferences were able to go through that experience, understand themselves what was at stake, not being told by somebody from the US, that was a liberating moment for us.
Because there has been lobbying from the global Methodist Church, hasn't there, all over the world, to try to find new recruits from people who oppose this progressive move in the United Methodist Church.
Well, my personal opinion on this was I found out that it was also about power and money and control. I think this is probably the elephant in the room that is not being told. I think I don't believe we can sell faith. I don't believe money can buy everything. This is an example where the Holy Spirit showed up and showed us the way to express love in the middle of diversity.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm sure we'll come back to you. Others will have questions for you, but thank you. The Reverend Jennifer Smith, Superintendent Minister of Westminster Chapel, London. I know people on the call have said that they will seek your wisdom and advice in a moment with questions to you. But can I ask you, first of all, listening to all these contributions, how you view what's been going on in the United Methodist Church? How you view the schism, the split, and the votes that were taken. As an outsider looking at it from London, how do you view what happened?
Yes, thank you. And I mean, I think that the conversation that you've heard is very representative of what the General Conference was like. I was a delegate to the General Conference from Britain, one of four that we had, with both voice and vote. As we're saying, we're not United Methodist, but because we're in this historic concordat, we, along with a few other churches that come from that look to Britain as their planting church, not the United States, are invited to be full participants. So as we voted, I think we had a very strong sense of that new birth that's talked about. And I have to say, I was also a member of the Lambeth Conference because my late husband was a diocesan Anglican bishop. And so I was part of the Bishop Spouses program and also that full deliberation, which happened last year. And my experience of that in some ways was much the same as this, that the reports from outside of the conference about its division felt very exaggerated in relation to what was actually going on in the conference room. And among the people who, I mean, my goodness, my own delegation was sitting just with Liberia, and we're sharing cake and sweets and Bibles and chat, and we're all getting tired together. We're all hoping together. And I think there's no substitute for the actual connectionism to which we're committed. And I want to say I'm an American, historically, although I've been in Britain for a long time. We wouldn't start from there. I mean, the disaffiliations, the divisions, I think grieve the heart of God. I think that people in good conscience will go forward, and I'm sure that God will use what has happened. It will be a new birth as well for those churches that are disaffiliated. Our European experience is that there may well be continued work together with the churches, the conferences that have left. And it isn't like we suddenly cross over the other side of the street, if we see each other coming. I think that we could do something different than divide. And so I'm culturally, and again, I don't think it's biblical, I think it's cultural. I'm uncomfortable, or I notice particularly the language about people not being in line with, or the idea that everybody who remains in a church has to agree with X or Y, any position, because I know that that's not what my church is like. And I know too that people sometimes vote yes for things in Christian community because God has put us together that they don't necessarily agree with, but because being together is part of Jesus' prayer for the church, that they may all be one. And so I know that when Wesley's Chapel, for instance, under our British discipline, took the decision to solemnize all marriages, which happened in 2019, people voted yes who were themselves not in conscience easy with same-sex marriage, but they felt like God was in control and God brought us together as this church, and we wanted to respect the providence of God. And I remember even at the World Council of Churches meeting last year, Archbishop Angelos saying, our diversity is not the result of misadventure. Our diversity is God's intention. And when I think about, I've done a lot of work with the Methodist Church in Nigeria, not the UMC affiliate, but the British, the Autonomous Methodist Church Nigeria. And I remember when a bishop friend of mine came to visit here, and he wasn't at all shocked by the queer folk that he saw around visibly. He was shocked by nursing homes. He was horrified. You do, and I had taken him to see a wonderful Methodist affiliated nursing home, and he said, "Why would people do this to their elders?" And I think our connectionism and the creative tension that God holds between us allows us to speak prophetically one to another. And not just across social issues, but around issues of peacemaking and economic justice and all, the grace of God, and how we might actually plan for the seventh generation, which is to come after us, because it's our responsibility right now. So I think it's more positive than just the brokenness would suggest.
Do you fear that this move towards regionalization will take away some of that connection between the different churches?
Yeah, I do. But I think that the good thing about fear is that fear is a warning to us to remember our own responsibility. The British situation is different. Our what used to be called daughter churches, our autonomous partner churches around the world, became autonomous when the countries became politically autonomous. We didn't keep an empire, thank God. It would have been wrong. And I think there's a strong element of post-colonial intrigue in this, to which Bishop Monday has alluded, and with great gentleness. And I think that we have to really be careful not to pull up the drawbridge when our own resources are straitened. Of course, what no one talks about, or we haven't spoken about yet, is the vast budget cuts which are coming through partly, not completely, but partly as a result of the disaffiliation whole controversy. And the people who suffer for that are not me in London, and on the whole, not folk in the US, but many folk overseas. And I'd like to see even those churches that have disaffiliated spend the same amount of money and time and resource overseas as they always did. And I think that also there's a real strong imperative for all of us to pay attention to all of us. And not because we're nice, but because actually God may have something to say in the burdens that my sister or brother church is carrying about my own context. The other thing, of course, is that certainly in London, most of us are from somewhere else. So this notion that we are easily divisible into folk from one place or folk from another, or that any of us is a tick box set of views, it's wrong. So we should stand in humility, but we're going to have to work at it.
Thank you. Just picking up the budget point, and perhaps I can go to Joseph and David here. In your research of the churches that disaffiliated, did most of the wealthy ones go and the smaller rural ones remain? How did that divide? What did you find?
We found the opposite, that it was more likely, although these differences are not huge, but definitely the churches that were more likely to leave were somewhat smaller, although churches of all sizes left. They were more rural. They were more likely to be led by what we call local pastors. So those people generally don't have a Master of Divinity degree and are licensed to serve an individual congregation. They're not under appointment. Those people, local pastors, were much more likely to leave.
Heather, am I right in saying that the budget for the whole church has more or less halved as a result of the quarter of the churches who had disaffiliated?
It is a variety of things, COVID also. We were already looking to cut the budget. It was about a 42% cut overall for the whole denominational budget, but one of the ways we're saving money is we're cutting the number of bishops in the US, but we're adding bishops in Africa. So we're adding 2 bishops in Africa and reducing our current number of bishops by 7. We're basically not going to be replacing in the US. We're not going to be replacing those who are retiring. So we're just kind of doing natural attrition. I work for an agency and we're seeing more than 50% cut. And so we'll see how that looks, but we are going to continue to make sure that we have our outreach around the globe. And that's going to continue to be something that we put a great deal of emphasis on. And that was one of the cool things for me at General Conferences, getting to work with people I usually only talk to via Zoom and email and WhatsApp, and getting to actually, these are colleagues of mine who are fellow News staff, and who, one of my colleagues is Evelyn Chikwana, who lives in Zimbabwe, and she had sort of our English language operations in Africa from Zimbabwe. And I had my colleague Joao Sambo, who oversees our Portuguese speaking or Lusophone channels. So, I mean, it was just so cool to be, and he lives in Mozambique. So it was just like so cool to be with them. So we're going to continue to work on maintaining those connections, and the budget is real, but I just want to put that out there. Thank you.
I was just wondering, as you look forward, what your area mission priorities are for the next 3 years going forward. And how can folk like me, who I'm not UMC, but I do sit, in a big pulpit with John Wesley buried in my garden, bless him, and with a really strong commitment to Methodist working all over, and also a lot of Congolese members locally. What are your mission priorities in the next 3 years?
Thank you, Jennifer. My priorities are, number one is the well-being of pastors, ministers, because most of them make less than $30 per month, because I lead a very rural annual conferences, very poor. And then the second is to build good places of worship. I mean, making sure that people have a space, even if we have our strong rains, they can still be able to be in a great building. And then third is the work around health and education. I think those continues to be our main priorities.
Thank you. Lindsay, you have a question.
My question is for David and for Joseph. In your research, what are things that we can glean, learn from in our moving forward? I appreciate Jennifer saying it just has to be walked. And so the next season and seasons just have to be walked. But I wonder, with the work you've done, what are some takeaways for us?
I think the number one takeaway from this whole program of research is that there is a diversity of opinion in the church. That this isn't we've talked about, folks have mentioned that it's a progressive move, and it certainly is a decision and a piece of legislation that's moving the church in a more progressive direction. But I think it's not quite accurate to describe this move as turning the church into a very progressive church or super liberal church. It's moving the church in a direction that is accepting a diversity of opinion and difference within the denomination. And so I think that the most important takeaway for religious leaders is to be, and I'm sure they already see this in their own congregations, but to be aware of that, to be aware that the denomination is saying we're going to accept people who have not historically been at home in the church, but it also means that there are going to be people in the church who have different opinions about what constitutes marriage, who maybe don't agree with the decision of General Conference, who maybe seriously consider leaving their congregation over that. And so in my conversations with leaders about this topic, what I've heard is that when people are deciding whether or not to leave the church, or when individual churches were deciding whether or not to leave the denomination, a really significant factor was the relationship with the clergy person, with their leader in the congregation. And that if it was a person that they trusted, a person that they felt like even if they disagreed with them, that they were heard, that they were respected as people, that their views were respected, then it meant that that church, this denomination, was a place that they felt at home in.
Divisions in the United States, political divisions, have become increasingly bitter over the past 3 decades. And this is presents a major challenge for the United States as a country. It's very hard to run a democratic country, when the two major political parties just absolutely detest one another. There is hope within the United Methodist Church, in that churches like the United Methodist Church and some other mainline Protestant churches are places where Democrats and Republicans are found in community together, trying to build community together, trying to do church together. And I think doubling down on helping people who disagree very profoundly, who may really find each other quite distasteful, but still are sitting across from one another in church, to find ways to build more understanding, to build tools that help people work together across divides, without this sort of endless American impetus to split and divide. I think that remains a really, really important piece for the future.
Thank you, David. Jonathan Peter from the Methodist Recorder. You ask your question?
Yeah, one of the aspects of this that hasn't been discussed, but may well have ramifications in this country, is the decision to go into sort of full communion or unite fully with the Episcopal Church in the USA. And obviously there are differences in structures between the Church of England over here and the American Episcopal Church, which has bishops, etc., and obviously is now pretty well in line on issues of sexuality. But I just wondered if anyone had any views on whether that's likely to happen, a sort of complete union it could happen between Methodists and Episcopalians, and whether that could have any ramifications over here, whether it might encourage further unity between the Methodist Church over here and the Church of England.
So basically, you know where we are. We've approved full communion. They're going to have the Episcopal Church is going to have its general convention later on this summer, and they have said that they're just going to have, as of last week, they were still planning on having a statement sort of saying they wanted to continue with deep relations with us, but they weren't going to vote on full communion until another 3 years later, mainly because they wanted to see what direction we were heading. But in any case, we are definitely getting closer. And I think decisions made this week, and let's be very clear here, the fact that we did have the prohibitions we had related to same-sex relationships absolutely was a stumbling block in that relationship. So I think that going away will strengthen our ties.
In our full communion of the Episcopal Church, one of the great debates will be the decision to give sacramental authorities to deacons. I think that's a very tough decision. In fact, we as United Methodists, I think we really need to think about other mechanism of how we can have discussions on these issues, because it really raises the question, what is the difference between the orders of being an elder and a deacon, especially when it comes to the ecumenical world.
We are very interested, Bishop, in how, I think I'll speak for Jonathan here as well, but journalists follow the Anglican Communion story very closely. And what's happened with the Anglican Communion, the splits, particularly with the bishops in Africa, is very interesting that your church in Africa is taking a different pathway. And it would be very interesting at some point to get you two groups together and see if we could have a conversation. Perhaps we can organise that, Jonathan, somehow or other. But it's a fascinating area. But I would like to give the last word to Stephen, if I may, who said in the chat box that he wanted to say something quite personal about your reflection on what had happened at the conference. And here's your chance now.
I think the main takeaway for me and for most people, and we started seeing that almost immediately, is that we are no longer deemed as incompatible with Christian teaching by the church that we have dedicated our lives to, that we love, that we want to help grow around the world. This just reverts us back to neutral. This actually provides the space for everybody to have a seat at the table, and for any churches to continue business as usual.
Thank you. And thank you all very much indeed for sparing the time to take part in this conversation. And we'll send you the links to when it appears online. And I hope you'll join us again for another briefing in the future.